A bride among the ruthless. Caterina Esposito had been raised to be the perfect wife. But before she could be married off to a man she didn't love, she was taken by Enzo Costa, a man her father had warned her never to cross. He smirked, his grip firm as he pulled her close. "You were never meant for him," he murmured. "You were always mine." Chapter 1. The Shadow of an Arranged Union. The scent of aged parchment and beeswax hung heavy in the air of Don Esposito's study, a room Caterina had always approached with a mixture of reverence and trepidation. Sunlight, filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, cast long shadows across the polished mahogany desk, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. Her father, a man whose presence commanded respect and whose silence could be more terrifying than any shout, sat behind it, his hands clasped before him, a single gold ring bearing the Esposito crest glinting on his finger. Caterina stood before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the silk of her pale blue dress a stark contrast to the dark, somber tones of the room. She was a portrait of controlled elegance, her dark hair swept up in a chignon, her posture impeccable, the result of years of meticulous training. Yet beneath the surface a storm brewed. At 57, Caterina was no longer the timid girl she once was, but the years of quiet obedience had left their mark. The lines around her eyes, faint but present, spoke of unshed tears and unspoken dreams. "Caterina," Don Esposito began, his voice a low rumble that resonated with the weight of generations, "you understand why you are here." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a reminder of the life she was born into. A life dictated by tradition and duty. "Yes, Papa," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. "The arrangements are finalized. The contract is signed." He paused, his gaze unwavering, assessing her. "Your marriage to Riccardo Bellini will secure our family's future. It will unite two of the most powerful families in the city. It is a necessary alliance." Riccardo Bellini. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. A man twice her age, with a reputation for cruelty that was whispered even among the hardened circles of their world. A man who saw women as possessions, trophies to be displayed and controlled. The thought of being his wife sent a shiver of dread down her spine. She had always known this day would come, that her life was not her own, but the reality of it was a cold, suffocating weight. "I understand, Papa," she repeated, the words hollow even to her own ears. He nodded, a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction in his eyes. "You have been raised to be a Don's wife, Caterina. You will not disappoint me." "No, Papa," she said softly. The meeting ended with a curt dismissal, leaving Caterina alone in the opulent prison of her family home. She walked through the familiar halls, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The portraits of her ancestors, stern-faced men and women who had built the Esposito Empire, seemed to watch her, their eyes filled with judgment. She paused before a large window overlooking the manicured gardens, the vibrant colors of the flowers a painful contrast to the grayness she felt inside. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman trapped in a gilded cage. The years had been kind to her in some ways, her features still retaining the youthful beauty that had once caught the eye of many suitors. But there was a weariness in her eyes, a sadness that had settled deep within her soul. She had buried her own dreams long ago, sacrificing her own desires for the sake of family. She had been a dutiful daughter, a silent observer, a woman who played her part flawlessly. But now, facing the prospect of a loveless marriage to a man she despised, a flicker of rebellion ignited within her. A sudden noise, a muffled shout from outside, drew her attention. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her gaze searching the shadows of the garden. Two figures were struggling near the ancient stone fountain, their movements obscured by the dense foliage. It was too far to see clearly, but there was a sense of urgency, of violence, that sent a jolt of fear through her. She turned to call for a guard, but hesitated. A strange instinct, a feeling she couldn't explain, held her back. The struggle continued, a silent ballet of shadows and desperation. Then, as quickly as it began, it ended. One figure fell to the ground, the other stood over him, panting, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers through the window. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. Katerina saw his face, a face that was both handsome and dangerous, a face that was etched in her memory even before this night. Infocosta, the son of her father's greatest rival, the man she had been warned to avoid at all costs. His eyes, dark and intense, held a mixture of defiance and something else, something that sent a shiver of both fear and fascination through her. He gave a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement, and then vanished into the darkness. Katerina stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The encounter, brief as it was, had shaken her to her core. It was a glimpse into a world she had always been shielded from, a world of violence and passion, a world that both terrified and intrigued her. The arranged union, the suffocating expectations, all seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the image of Enzo Costa's face and the unsettling feeling that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The meticulously crafted world around her had, suddenly and violently, sprouted a crack. And through that crack, a storm was brewing. Chapter 2. A glimpse of the forbidden. The memory of Enzo Costa's face, stark and unsettling against the twilight, haunted Katerina's dreams that night. It wasn't a dream of fear, but of a strange, unsettling curiosity. She saw his eyes, dark and piercing, reflecting a world of shadows and secrets, a world that was both forbidden and alluring. She woke with a start, the sheets tangled around her legs, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The grand bedroom, usually a sanctuary of quiet elegance, felt oppressive, the silence amplifying the turmoil within her. Dawn painted the sky in hues of pale rose and gold, but the beauty of the morning did little to soothe her restless spirit. She dressed mechanically, choosing a simple, high-necked dress of deep emerald green, its color a stark contrast to the pallor of her skin. The mirror reflected a woman on the edge, her usual composure fractured by the events of the previous evening and the looming specter of her impending marriage. The household was already abuzz with activity, preparations for the upcoming nuptials in full swing. Katerina moved through the flurry of activity like a ghost, her presence acknowledged, but her inner turmoil unseen. The scent of lilies, Riccardo Bellini's favorite flower, permeated the air, their cloying sweetness making her stomach churn. She found refuge in the small, private chapel tucked away at the back of the villa, a place where she had often sought solace in the past. The chapel was a haven of cool tranquility, the stained glass windows casting kaleidoscopic patterns of light across the stone floor. The air was thick with the scent of incense and old stone, a scent that evoked memories of her childhood, of simpler times before the weight of family expectations had settled upon her shoulders. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped tightly in prayer, but the familiar words offered little comfort. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, fear, resentment, and a strange, undeniable pull towards the dangerous world represented by Enzo Costa. She remembered the stories she had heard about him, whispered in hushed tones by the servants and her father's associates. Enzo Costa was a man to be feared, a man who had risen through the ranks of his family's organization with ruthless efficiency. He was known for his intelligence, his cunning, and his unwavering loyalty to his family. He was also, according to the rumors, a man who enjoyed the darker pleasures of life, a man who lived by his own rules. Katerina had always dismissed these stories as exaggerations, the product of fear and envy. But seeing him last night, witnessing the violence in the garden, had shattered her carefully constructed illusions. He was everything she had been taught to despise, everything she had been warned to avoid. And yet, she couldn't deny the strange fascination he held for her. A sound behind her, the soft creak of the chapel door, made her jump. She turned, expecting to see one of the servants, but it was her father's consigliere Antonio, who stood there, his face etched with concern. "Signorina Katerina," he said, his voice low and respectful. "Your father requests your presence in the library." Antonio was a man of few words, but his eyes spoke volumes. He had been with the Esposito family for decades, a trusted advisor and confidant. He had always treated Caterina with a kindness that bordered on paternal, and she sensed that he knew more than he was letting on. "Is something wrong, Antonio?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "There has been an incident. Your father wishes to speak with you about it." An incident. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Caterina's heart clenched with a sense of foreboding. She followed Antonio through the silent corridors of the villa, her mind racing. Had Enzo Costa's actions in the garden been discovered? Was she somehow implicated? The library, like her father's study, was a room of dark wood and leather-bound books, a place where secrets were kept and decisions were made. Don Esposito stood by the window, his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him. He turned as she entered, his face a mask of controlled anger. "Caterina," he said, his voice sharp and cold, "we have a problem." He gestured towards a chair.
"Seat."
She obeyed, her legs trembling slightly. He remained standing, his presence dominating the room. "Last night, there was a disturbance in the garden. One of my men was attacked." Caterina's breath caught in her throat. She had known it. The attacker was identified, her father continued, his gaze fixed on her. It was Enzo Costa. She forced herself to meet his eyes, to maintain a facade of calm. I saw something from my window, Papa, but it was dark. I couldn't be sure who it was. It was a lie, a desperate attempt to protect herself, to protect Enzo. The thought startled her. Why would she feel the need to protect him? Don Esposito studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching for any sign of deception. She held her breath, praying that her carefully constructed mask wouldn't crumble. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Enzo Costa is a threat to our family, Caterina. He is a viper in our midst. And you, my daughter, are about to marry into a family that will solidify our power and protect us from his kind." His voice hardened. "Do not forget that." The weight of his words, the implicit threat, settled upon her like a shroud. She was a pawn in a deadly game, a game she had no desire to play. But as she looked into her father's eyes, she saw not just anger, but also fear. And in that moment, she realized that even the powerful Don Esposito was vulnerable. The forbidden glimpse had shown her more than just a rival, it had revealed the fragility of the world she knew. And the unsettling face of Enzo Costa was somehow at the center of it all. Chapter 3. The Night of Reckoning. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of activity, a suffocating whirlwind of fittings, floral arrangements, and endless meetings with Riccardo Bellini's family. Caterina moved through it all like a sleepwalker, her mind preoccupied with the looming threat of Enzo Costa and the unsettling feeling that her life was spiraling out of control. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows, a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded her. Riccardo Bellini, for his part, seemed oblivious to her inner turmoil. He treated her with a possessive courtesy that made her skin crawl, his eyes lingering on her with a predatory gleam that sent shivers down her spine. He showered her with expensive gifts, jewels, and silks that felt like chains binding her to a future she dreaded. He spoke of their future together, of the children they would have, of the power they would wield, his words painting a picture of a life that was the antithesis of everything she secretly yearned for. The wedding was to be held at the Grand Cathedral in the heart of the city, a lavish affair designed to showcase the power and prestige of the Esposito and Bellini families. The guest list was a who's who of the city's elite, a mix of politicians, businessmen, and, of course, the heads of the other powerful mafia families. Security was tight, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter, a stark reminder of the ever-present threat of violence that lurked beneath the veneer of civility. Caterina spent the morning of the wedding in a state of numb resignation. She allowed the stylist to dress her, to paint her face, to transform her into the perfect bride, a vision of ethereal beauty in a white lace gown that cost more than most people earned in a year. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, but she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. It was a stranger, a beautiful, hollow shell, devoid of life and spirit. As she walked down the aisle of the cathedral, her arm linked with her father's, the sound of the organ echoing through the vast space, she felt a sense of detachment, as if she were watching the scene unfold from afar. The faces of the guests were a blur, their eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and envy. She saw Riccardo Bellini waiting for her at the altar, his face smug with satisfaction, his eyes glinting with possessive pride. The ceremony proceeded with a solemn grandeur, the ancient rituals and vows echoing through the cathedral. Caterina repeated the words mechanically, her voice devoid of emotion. She felt nothing, just a hollow emptiness where her heart should have been. As the priest pronounced them husband and wife, and Riccardo Bellini leaned in to kiss her, a sudden commotion erupted at the back of the cathedral. Shouts and screams filled the air, the sound of shattering glass and panicked cries piercing the solemn silence. Caterina turned, her heart leaping into her throat, to see a scene of chaos unfolding. Men in black suits were fighting, their movements swift and brutal. Guests were scrambling for cover, their faces contorted with fear. And then she saw him. Enzo Costa. He stood in the center of the melee, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes blazing with a dangerous intensity. He moved with a lethal grace, dispatching his opponents with swift, decisive blows. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of violence that seemed to consume everything in its path. Caterina watched, transfixed, as he fought his way towards the altar, his gaze fixed on her. There was no fear in her heart, only a strange, exhilarating sense of anticipation. It was as if a part of her had been waiting for this moment, for this eruption of chaos that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of her life. Riccardo Bellini, his face contorted with rage and disbelief, drew a gun, his hand shaking. He aimed it at Enzo, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You bastard!" he screamed. "I'll kill you." But before he could fire, a shot rang out from somewhere in the cathedral. Riccardo Bellini gasped, his eyes widening in surprise, and crumpled to the ground, a crimson stain spreading across his white shirt. Silence descended upon the cathedral, a silence broken only by the sound of Enzo Costa's breathing. He stood over Riccardo Bellini's body, his gun still smoking, his gaze locked on Caterina's. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. The crowd parted before him, their faces pale with terror. He reached the altar, his presence radiating a dangerous power that seemed to fill the entire cathedral. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke, his voice low and resonant, a voice that seemed to penetrate the very depths of her soul. "You were never meant for him," he murmured, his grip firm as he reached out and took her hand. "You were always mine." He pulled her close, his arm encircling her waist, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her body. The scent of gunpowder and something else, something primal and intoxicating, filled her nostrils. The world around her seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, standing in the center of the chaos, bound together by a force she couldn't comprehend. The night of reckoning had arrived, and Caterina Esposito, the dutiful daughter, the soon-to-be bride, was gone. In her place stood a woman on the precipice of a new life, a life filled with danger and desire, a life inextricably linked to the man who had just stolen her from the altar. Chapter 4. Into the Lion's Denver. The escape from the cathedral was a blur of adrenaline and controlled chaos. Enzo, his hand firmly clasped around Caterina's, navigated the panicked crowd with a practiced ease, his men forming a protective barrier around them. Gunfire echoed sporadically, but it seemed to be directed away from them, a diversionary tactic to cover their retreat. Caterina, still reeling from the shock of Riccardo's death and Enzo's audacious act, stumbled along beside him, her elaborate wedding gown a hindrance in the narrow, crowded aisles. Outside, the city was a cacophony of sirens and shouting. The police were arriving, their presence adding another layer of urgency to their escape. Enzo led her to a black, unmarked car, its engine already running. He pushed her into the back seat, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the urgency of the situation, and slid in beside her. The driver, a burly man with a scarred face, sped away from the cathedral, weaving through the narrow streets with reckless abandon. Katerina, her mind still struggling to process the events of the past hour, looked at Enzo. He was leaning back against the seat, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and even. He seemed remarkably calm considering the circumstances. The blood on his hands, Ricardo's blood, was a stark reminder of the violence he was capable of. She should be terrified, she knew, but the fear was overshadowed by a strange sense of exhilaration, a feeling of liberation she hadn't experienced in years. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He opened his eyes, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Somewhere safe," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "Somewhere they won't find you." "They?" she questioned, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. "Your father. The Bellinis. The police," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "You're a wanted woman now, Katerina. An accomplice to murder." The words hit her like a physical blow. She was an accomplice. She had stood there, watched him kill Ricardo, and hadn't uttered a word of protest. She had run with him, willingly, into the unknown. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice choked with emotion. He looked at her, a flicker of something that might have been sympathy in his eyes. "You didn't have a choice," he said softly. "Not anymore." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her. His fingers were strong and calloused, the hands of a man who was used to violence, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. He held her hand tightly, as if he were afraid she might disappear. The car sped through the night, leaving the city behind, heading towards the outskirts, towards the unknown. Katerina looked out the window, watching the lights of the city fade into the distance. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, her family, her home, her carefully constructed life. She was entering a new world, a world of danger and uncertainty, a world ruled by men like Enzo Costa. They arrived at their destination in the early hours of the morning, a secluded villa nestled in the hills overlooking the sea. The villa was imposing, a fortress of stone and steel, surrounded by high walls and guarded by armed men. It was a far cry from the opulent elegance of her family home, but it had a stark beauty of its own, a sense of raw power that both intimidated and intrigued her. Enzo led her inside, the villa silent and still in the pre-dawn light. The interior was surprisingly luxurious, furnished with antique furniture and decorated with priceless works of art. It was a testament to the Costa family's wealth and power, a stark contrast to the violence and chaos that surrounded them. He showed her to a room, a large, opulent space with a four-poster bed and a balcony overlooking the sea. It was a beautiful room, but it felt like a prison cell. "Get some rest," he said, his voice softening slightly. "We'll talk in the morning." He left her alone, closing the door behind him, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the silence. Katerina stood in the middle of the room, feeling lost and overwhelmed. She was a prisoner, a captive, but she was also free from the suffocating constraints of her former life. She was in a lion's den, surrounded by danger, but she was also with Enzo Costa, the man who had stolen her away, the man who had awakened something within her that she had thought long dead. The future was uncertain, terrifying, but for the first time in a long time, Katerina felt alive. The feeling, however, was laced with a profound and unsettling sense of dread, a premonition that the calm was merely the eye of the storm. Chapter 5. Whispers of the Costa Legacy. The morning light, filtering through the sheer curtains of the balcony, woke Katerina. She had slept fitfully, her dreams a chaotic jumble of images, her father's angry face, Ricardo's lifeless eyes, and Enzo's dark, intense gaze. She rose from the bed, her body stiff and aching, her mind still reeling from the events of the previous day. The white wedding gown, now crumpled and stained, lay discarded on the floor, a stark reminder of the life she had left behind. She found a robe hanging in the wardrobe, a luxurious garment of silk and velvet, and wrapped it around herself. She walked out onto the balcony, the cool morning air a welcome contrast to the stuffiness of the room. The view was breathtaking, the vast expanse of the sea stretching out before her, the waves crashing against the rocky shore below. The beauty of the scene was a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. She was a prisoner in this luxurious villa, a captive of Enzo Costa, a man she barely knew but who held her fate in his hands. She had no idea what his plans were for her, what he expected of her. Was she a bargaining chip, a pawn in his war against her father? Or was there something more, something deeper, behind his actions? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered and unsettling. She leaned against the railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon, trying to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed her life. A knock on the door startled her. She turned, her heart pounding, to see Enzo standing there, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in dark, casual clothes, his hair slightly disheveled, his appearance a stark contrast to the polished elegance of the men she had grown up around. "I brought you some clothes," he said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured towards a chair where a pile of clothing lay neatly folded. "And some breakfast." He entered the room, carrying a tray laden with food, fresh fruit, pastries, and strong, black coffee. The aroma filled the room, a welcome distraction from her anxieties. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He placed the tray on a small table near the window and gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, her legs trembling slightly. He sat opposite her, his gaze fixed on her, his eyes intense and searching. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. She nodded, her heart clenching with a sense of foreboding. She knew this conversation was inevitable, that the time had come for him to reveal his intentions. He began by telling her about his family, the Costa legacy. He spoke of generations of men who had built their empire, of their struggles, their triumphs, and their betrayals. He spoke of the code they lived by, a code of honor and loyalty, a code that demanded respect and obedience. He spoke of his father, a man he revered and feared, a man who had taught him everything he knew. "My father was a hard man," he said, his voice laced with a mixture of respect and regret. "But he was also a just man. He believed in family, in loyalty, in protecting what was his." He paused, his gaze shifting to the window, his eyes filled with a distant sadness. "He was killed 5 years ago," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Murdered by a rival family, by your father's allies." The words hit Katerina like a physical blow. Her father had been involved in the death of Enzo's father? The thought was shocking, horrifying. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice choked with emotion. He looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "I know you didn't," he said softly. "You were never meant to be part of this world." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her. His fingers were strong and calloused, but his grip was gentle. "But you are now," he continued, his voice firm. "You are my wife, Katerina. In the eyes of our world, you are Acosta, his wife." The word echoed in her mind, a word that held both promise and peril. She was bound to him, not by love, but by circumstance, by violence, by the ancient codes of their families. She was Acosta, a member of a family she had always been taught to fear. The whispers of their legacy, of their power and their ruthlessness, were no longer distant rumors, they were the reality of her new life. And she had no idea what that meant for her future. The weight of it was overwhelming, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate her. Yet, within that weight, there was a spark, a flicker of defiance, a refusal to be merely a victim of circumstance. Chapter 6. Unveiling the Captor's Mask. The days that followed were a strange mixture of captivity and tentative connection. Katerina remained confined to the villa, her movements restricted, her interactions limited to Enzo and his men. She spent her time exploring the villa, reading in the vast library, and walking in the secluded gardens, always under the watchful eye of the guards. She was a prisoner, but a prisoner in a gilded cage, treated with a respect that bordered on reverence. Enzo, for his part, remained an enigma. He was often absent, attending to the business of his family, leaving Katerina alone with her thoughts and anxieties.
When he was present, he was a study in contrasts.
He could be distant and brooding, his eyes shadowed with a darkness that sent shivers down her spine. But he could also be surprisingly gentle, his touch soft, his voice laced with a tenderness that she hadn't expected. He began to share more of himself with her, revealing glimpses of the man behind the mask of the ruthless capo. He spoke of his childhood, of his love for his mother, of his struggles to live up to his father's expectations. He spoke of his passion for art, for music, for the beauty of the world around him, a stark contrast to the violence that permeated his life. One evening, he found her in the library, lost in the pages of a book of Italian poetry. He stood silently for a moment, watching her, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice a low murmur that broke the silence. "You enjoy poetry?" he asked. She looked up, startled, and nodded. "Yes," she replied, her voice hesitant. It helps me escape." He smiled, a rare and genuine smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. "Escape from what?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. "From everything," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "From the life I left behind, from the uncertainty of the future." She stopped, unable to articulate the complex emotions that swirled within her. He understood. He nodded, his eyes filled with a knowing sadness. "I understand," he said softly. "We all need to escape sometimes." He walked over to the bookshelf and ran his fingers along the spines of the books, his touch lingering on a volume of Dante's Inferno. "Dante understood the darkness," he said, his voice thoughtful. "He understood the struggle between good and evil, between heaven and hell." He pulled the book from the shelf and opened it, his fingers tracing the words on the page. He began to read aloud, his voice deep and resonant, filling the room with the beauty of the Italian language. He read with a passion, a feeling, that surprised Katerina. She had never heard him speak like this before, with such vulnerability, such emotion. As he read, she watched him, fascinated. The mask of the ruthless capo seemed to slip away, revealing the man beneath, a man who was complex, intelligent, and surprisingly sensitive. She saw the pain in his eyes, the burden of his responsibilities, the loneliness that haunted him. She saw a man who was capable of great violence, but also of great love. He finished reading, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. He closed the book and looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you understand now, Katerina?" he asked, his voice soft. "Do you understand why I did what I did?" She nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand, not just his actions, but also his motivations, his pain, his desire for revenge, his need for connection. She was beginning to see him, not just as her captor, but as a man with a past, a man with a heart, a man who, despite everything, had shown her a kindness she hadn't expected. "I'm starting to," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar shiver through her. His fingers were strong and warm, his grip firm but gentle. "I know this isn't the life you wanted, Katerina," he said, his voice laced with regret. "But I promise you, I will protect you. I will keep you safe." His words, his touch, his gaze, all conveyed a sincerity that she couldn't ignore. She was still a prisoner, still uncertain of her future, but she was no longer alone. She had found a connection with Enzo Costa, a connection that was both dangerous and alluring, a connection that was beginning to unravel the carefully constructed walls around her heart. The captor's mask was slowly unveiling, revealing a man she was both afraid of and drawn to, a man who was becoming increasingly difficult to resist. This unveiling, however, came with the chilling realization that she was stepping further and further into a world from which there might be no return. Chapter 7. Echoes of a Forgotten Past. The villa, despite its imposing exterior and the ever-present guards, began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Katerina found a rhythm to her days, a routine that helped to soothe her anxieties and fill the void left by her former life. She spent hours exploring the extensive grounds, discovering hidden gardens, ancient olive groves, and secluded terraces with breathtaking views of the sea. She rediscovered her love for painting, setting up an easel on the balcony of her room and capturing the ever-changing colors of the sea and sky. Enzo, when he was present, continued to reveal glimpses of his hidden depths. He showed her his collection of antique weapons, each piece with its own story, its own history of violence and bloodshed. He played the piano for her, his fingers moving across the keys with a skill and passion that belied his rough exterior. He taught her about the intricacies of the wine-making process, taking her on a tour of the villa's extensive cellars, explaining the nuances of each vintage. One afternoon, he found her in the gardens, tending to a patch of neglected rose bushes. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, her hair pulled back in a braid, her hands covered in dirt. She looked up as he approached, her face flushed from the exertion, her eyes sparkling with a newfound vitality. "You have a green thumb," he observed, a hint of amusement in his voice. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "My grandmother used to have a rose garden," she said, her voice wistful. "She taught me everything I know." Her grandmother, a memory, long buried, surfaced in Katerina's mind. A memory of a warm, loving woman, a woman who had been a refuge from the strictures of her family life. A woman who had told her stories of a life beyond the confines of the Esposito world. "Tell me about her," Enzo said, his voice soft. He sat down beside her on a stone bench, his presence a comforting weight. Katerina hesitated, unsure whether to share this intimate part of her past with him. But there was something in his eyes, a genuine interest, a desire to know her, that encouraged her to open up. She began to speak, her voice hesitant at first, then gaining confidence as the memories flooded back. She spoke of her grandmother's love for gardening, of her gentle wisdom, of her rebellious spirit. She spoke of the summers she had spent with her in a small village in the countryside, a world away from the formality and rigidity of her family home. She spoke of the freedom she had felt there, the sense of belonging, the connection to nature. As she spoke, Enzo listened intently, his gaze fixed on her, his expression softening with each word. He asked questions, probing deeper, encouraging her to share more, to reveal the hidden corners of her heart. He learned that Katerina's grandmother, Isabella, had been ostracized by the Esposito family for marrying a man they deemed unsuitable, a man who was not of their social standing, a man who was, in their eyes, a commoner. Isabella had defied her family, choosing love over duty, a choice that had cost her dearly. "She was the only one who truly understood me," Katerina said, her voice choked with emotion. "She taught me that it was okay to be different, to follow my own path, to question the rules." Enzo nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," he said softly. "She was," Katerina replied, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "She died when I was 15. I never really got over it." Enzo reached out and gently wiped away the tear with his thumb, his touch sending a shiver through her. His fingers lingered on her cheek, his gaze locked on hers. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice husky with emotion. In that moment, something shifted between them. The barriers that had separated them, the roles of captor and captive, seemed to dissolve, replaced by a shared understanding, a shared sense of loss, a shared connection to the past. Katerina saw in Enzo's eyes a reflection of her own pain, her own longing for connection, her own yearning for a life beyond the confines of duty and expectation. The echoes of her forgotten past, stirred by memories of her grandmother, had resonated with Enzo's own hidden wounds, creating a bond that transcended their circumstances. It was a bond forged in shared sorrow, a bond that was beginning to feel dangerously like hope. But hope, in their world, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the harsh realities of their present. Chapter 8. The Dance of Defiance and Desire. The connection forged in the garden deepened with each passing day. Katerina found herself drawn to Enzo, her initial fear replaced by a growing fascination, a hesitant trust, and a burgeoning desire that both thrilled and terrified her. She began to anticipate his presence, her heart quickening at the sound of his footsteps, her senses heightened when he was near. He, in turn, seemed to seek out her company, finding excuses to spend time with her, engaging her in conversations that ranged from the mundane to the profound. He challenged her assumptions, questioned her beliefs, and encouraged her to embrace her own desires, her own passions, her own rebellious spirit. He was slowly, subtly, dismantling the walls she had built around herself, exposing the woman she had hidden for so long. One evening, he invited her to join him for dinner on the terrace overlooking the sea. The table was set with fine china and crystal, candles flickering in the gentle breeze, the air filled with the scent of jasmine and the sound of the waves crashing below. It was a scene of romantic elegance, a stark contrast to the violence that lurked beneath the surface of their lives. Katerina wore a dress that Enzo had chosen for her, a flowing gown of deep blue silk that clung to her curves and accentuated her dark beauty. She felt a nervous excitement, a sense of anticipation that she hadn't experienced in years. He greeted her with a smile, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face. He took her hand and led her to the table, his touch sending a familiar shiver through her. "You look beautiful, Katerina," he said, his voice husky with admiration. She blushed, her heart fluttering at his compliment. She felt beautiful for the first time in a long time. She felt seen, appreciated, desired. They dined on a simple but elegant meal of fresh seafood and pasta, accompanied by a crisp white wine from the villa cellars. They talked, not of family business or the dangers that surrounded them, but of art, of music, of literature, of their dreams and aspirations. They laughed, a genuine, heartfelt laughter that filled the air, a sound that had been absent from Katerina's life for far too long. As the evening progressed, the conversation became more intimate, more personal. Enzo spoke of his loneliness, of his longing for connection, of his desire for a life beyond the confines of his family's legacy. Katerina, in turn, confessed her own fears, her own regrets, her own yearning for a love that had always seemed out of reach. After dinner, Enzo led her to a small, secluded alcove on the terrace, where a fire crackled in a stone fireplace, casting a warm glow on their faces. He poured them each a glass of brandy, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal glasses. He sat beside her on a cushioned bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, smell the subtle scent of his cologne, a mixture of sandalwood and spice. He looked at her, his eyes intense and searching, his gaze lingering on her lips. "Katerina," he said, his voice a low murmur. He hesitated, his expression uncertain, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and vulnerability. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. She leaned into his touch, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted him to kiss her, she realized, with a sudden, overwhelming intensity. She wanted to feel his lips on hers, to taste him, to surrender to the desire that had been building between them. The dance of defiance and desire had reached its climax. Katerina, the dutiful daughter, the obedient wife, was gone, replaced by a woman who was ready to embrace her own passions, her own desires, a woman who was ready to risk everything for a chance at a love that was both forbidden and irresistible. The moment hung in the air, charged with unspoken emotions, with the promise of a surrender that would change everything. But even in this moment of intense intimacy, a sliver of fear remained, a reminder that their dance was taking place on the edge of a precipice. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and they could both fall. Chapter 9. Cracks in the Foundation. He leaned in, his breath warm against her skin, his eyes dark with a desire that mirrored her own. She closed her eyes, anticipating the kiss, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. But the kiss never came. A sudden noise, the sharp ring of a telephone, shattered the moment, pulling them abruptly back to reality. Enzo swore under his breath, his expression shifting from desire to annoyance, then to something else, something that looked like concern. He rose from the bench and walked over to a small table where the telephone sat, its insistent ringing filling the silence. He answered it, his voice curt and businesslike. "Costa," he said, his tone sharp. Katerina watched him, her heart sinking, the spell broken. She could hear only one side of the conversation, but it was clear that something was wrong. Enzo's expression grew increasingly grim, his body tense, his hand gripping the phone tightly. He spoke in rapid Italian, his words clipped and urgent. He listened, his eyes darkening with anger, then with a flicker of fear. He slammed the phone down, his hand trembling. "What is it?" Katerina asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to her, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Trouble," he said, his voice tight. "My father's old enemies. They're making a move." The Bellinis, she realized, with a sickening jolt. The family she was supposed to have married into, the family Enzo had wronged by killing Riccardo. They were seeking revenge. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It means we're not safe here," he replied, his tone grim. "We have to leave. Now." The romantic interlude, the tentative connection, the burgeoning desire, all vanished, replaced by the harsh reality of their situation. They were no longer two individuals exploring a forbidden attraction. They were once again captor and captive, caught in a web of violence and revenge. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm and urgent. "Come," he said, his voice commanding. "We have no time to waste." They left the villa in a hurry, the remnants of their interrupted dinner left untouched on the table, the fire in the fireplace dying down, a symbol of the extinguished flame of their budding romance. They drove through the night, the car speeding along winding roads, heading towards an unknown destination, the silence in the car heavy with unspoken tension. Katerina looked at Enzo, his face illuminated by the dashboard lights, his expression hard and determined. The mask of the ruthless capo was back in place, the vulnerable man she had glimpsed earlier hidden once again. She realized that the foundation of their fragile relationship, built on stolen moments and whispered confessions, was cracking under the pressure of their circumstances. The dance of defiance and desire had been interrupted, replaced by the harsh reality of their world, a world where love and trust were luxuries they could not afford. The cracks were widening, threatening to shatter the fragile bond they had forged, leaving them vulnerable and exposed to the dangers that surrounded them. The idyllic interlude was over, and the storm, long brewing, was about to break. Chapter 10. The Price of Loyalty. They drove for hours, the landscape changing from rolling hills to rugged mountains, the road becoming increasingly narrow and treacherous. Enzo remained silent, his focus entirely on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Katerina, exhausted and anxious, watched the passing scenery, her mind racing, trying to anticipate what lay ahead. They arrived at their destination in the early hours of the morning, a small, isolated village nestled high in the mountains, a place that seemed untouched by time. The houses were made of stone, their roofs covered in slate, the narrow streets winding and steep. It was a place of stark beauty, a place of refuge, but also a place of isolation. Enzo led her to a small, unassuming house at the edge of the village, a house that looked like it had been abandoned for years. He unlocked the door, the hinges creaking in protest, and ushered her inside. The interior was surprisingly clean and well-maintained, furnished with simple but comfortable furniture. It was clear that someone had been taking care of the place, preparing it for their arrival. "This is a safe house," Enzo explained, his voice weary. "Belongs to an old associate of my father's. No one knows about it." He showed her to a small bedroom, the only room with a bed. "Get some rest," he said, his voice softening slightly. "We'll talk in the morning." He left her alone, closing the door behind him. Katerina sank onto the bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. She was safe for now, but she was also trapped, more isolated than ever before. She was completely dependent on Enzo, a man she was beginning to care for, but a man who was also a dangerous criminal, a man whose loyalty to his family outweighed everything else. She thought of her own family, of her father, of the life she had left behind. She wondered if they were worried about her, if they were searching for her. She doubted it. She was a pawn in their game, a means to an end. And now, she was a pawn in Enzo's game, a tool to be used in his war against his enemies. The morning brought no answers, only more questions. Enzo was gone when she woke up, leaving behind a note saying he had gone to meet with his associate. She spent the day exploring the house, finding a small library filled with old books, a kitchen stocked with basic supplies, and a small garden overgrown with weeds. She tried to distract herself, to lose herself in the books and the garden, but her thoughts kept returning to Enzo, to her precarious situation, to the uncertain future. She felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition that something was wrong. He returned late in the afternoon, his face grim, his eyes shadowed with a darkness she hadn't seen before. He didn't speak, just walked past her, heading straight for the small living room. She followed him, her heart pounding with apprehension. He sat down on the sofa, his head in his hands, his body slumped with exhaustion. She sat beside him, her hand hovering over his shoulder, hesitant to touch him. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. "My associate," he said, his voice hoarse. "He betrayed me. He sold me out to the Bellinis."
Betrayed.
The word echoed in the silence, heavy with the weight of its meaning. Enzo, the powerful capo, the man who seemed invincible, had been betrayed by someone he trusted. The price of loyalty, it seemed, was often betrayal. What are we going to do?" Katerina asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his gaze intense and unwavering.
"We fight," he said, his voice firm.
"We fight for our survival. We fight for our freedom." He stood up, his body tense with a renewed energy, a dangerous determination in his eyes. He was no longer the weary, defeated man who had sat on the sofa moments before. He was the capo, the warrior, the leader. He turned to her, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. "And we fight for us, Katerina," he added, his voice softer now, a hint of vulnerability returning. "We fight for a future together." His words, his touch, his gaze, rekindled the spark of hope that had been flickering within her. Despite the danger, despite the betrayal, despite the uncertainty, she believed him. She believed in him. She believed in them. The price of loyalty might be high, but the price of love, she was beginning to realize, might be even higher. And she was willing to pay it. The decision, however, felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to an inevitable fate. Chapter 11. A glimmer of hope in darkness. The betrayal by his associate had shaken Enzo, but it had also steeled his resolve. He spent the next few days making plans, contacting his loyal allies, gathering information, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Bellinis. He was a man transformed, his focus absolute, his determination unwavering. He was a leader, a warrior, and Katerina saw a side of him that both terrified and impressed her. Despite the urgency of the situation, he made time for her, including her in his planning, explaining his strategies, seeking her opinion. He treated her not as a captive, not as a pawn, but as a partner and equal. It was a subtle but significant shift in their relationship, a recognition of her strength, her intelligence, her resilience. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, poring over maps and documents, he looked at her, his eyes softening. "You're different, Katerina," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You're not like the other women in our world." She looked up at him, her heart quickening at his words. "How so?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "You're strong," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You're intelligent. You're not afraid to challenge me, to question me. You see me, Katerina, not just the capo, but the man." His words touched her deeply, a validation of the woman she had always been, the woman she had hidden for so long. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, a silent acknowledgement of their connection. "And you see me," she replied, her voice soft. "Not just the Don's daughter, but the woman I am." He smiled, a rare and genuine smile that transformed his face. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that was a stark contrast to the violence that surrounded them. It was a kiss of hope, of promise, of a shared future, however uncertain. The following days were filled with a quiet intensity, a sense of impending doom, but also a glimmer of hope. They worked together, preparing for the inevitable, their bond strengthening with each passing hour. They shared stories, dreams, fears, their vulnerabilities exposed, their connection deepening. Katerina discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She learned to handle a gun, Enzo teaching her the basics of self-defense, his patience surprising, his respect for her growing. She helped him decipher coded messages, her knowledge of languages and her sharp mind proving invaluable. She was no longer the passive observer, the obedient daughter, she was an active participant, a warrior in her own right. One afternoon, while exploring the area around the house, Katerina stumbled upon a small, hidden chapel, its door ajar, its interior dark and dusty. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the air cool and still, the scent of incense and old stone filling her nostrils. The chapel was simple, with a small altar, a few wooden pews, and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns of light across the stone floor. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary, a reminder of a faith she had almost forgotten. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped in prayer, not the rote prayers of her childhood, but a heartfelt plea for guidance, for strength, for protection. She prayed for Enzo, for his safety, for their future together. She prayed for a miracle, a way out of the darkness, a glimmer of hope in a world consumed by violence and betrayal. As she prayed, she felt a sense of calm, a sense of peace, a sense of renewed faith. She was not alone. She had Enzo. She had her own strength. And she had a glimmer of hope, a belief that somehow, someway, they would survive this, that they would find a way to build a life together, a life beyond the confines of their family's legacies, a life free from the shadows of the past. This newfound faith, however fragile, was a beacon in the encroaching darkness, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a testament to the power of love in the face of adversity. But even as she prayed, the distant sound of approaching cars served as a chilling reminder that the darkness was closing in. Chapter 12. Secrets Buried in the Villa. The sound of approaching cars shattered the fragile peace Katerina had found in the chapel. She rushed outside, her heart pounding with a sense of dread, to see Enzo standing in front of the house, his body tense, his hand resting on the gun tucked into his waistband. "They're here," he said, his voice grim, his eyes scanning the road. The Bellinis. They had found them. The betrayal had been complete. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm and urgent.
"Come," he said, his voice commanding.
"We have to go.
Now."
They ran, not towards the road, but away from it, towards the dense forest that surrounded the village. Enzo knew a secret passage, a hidden escape route, that led from the cellar of the house to a secluded cave in the mountains. They descended into the darkness of the cellar, the air cool and damp, the scent of earth and decay filling their nostrils. Enzo found the hidden lever, a stone concealed within the wall, and pulled it, revealing a narrow passage, barely wide enough for one person to pass through. "Go," he urged, pushing her gently into the passage. "I'll be right behind you." Katerina crawled through the passage, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She could hear the sounds of the Bellinis entering the house, their shouts and curses echoing through the stone walls. She could hear Enzo engaging them, his gunfire a deafening roar in the confined space. She emerged from the passage into the cool, damp air of the cave, her body trembling, her clothes covered in dirt. She waited, her breath catching in her throat, listening to the sounds of the battle raging below. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The gunfire ceased. The shouting subsided. Silence descended, a heavy, ominous silence that was more terrifying than the sounds of violence. Had Enzo survived? Had he been captured? Had he been killed? She couldn't bear the uncertainty.
She had to know.
She started to crawl back through the passage, her heart pounding, her mind filled with a desperate need to see him, to help him. But before she could reach the entrance, she heard his voice, his low, reassuring murmur, echoing through the passage. "Katerina," he called, his voice strained but alive. "Stay there. It's not safe." Relief washed over her, a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. He was alive. He had survived. He emerged from the passage, his clothes torn and bloodied, his face grim, but his eyes filled with a fierce determination. He had defeated the Bellinis, but at a cost. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling, reaching out to touch his wounds. He winced, but shook his head. "Just scratches," he said, his voice hoarse. "Nothing serious." He looked around the cave, his gaze searching, his expression troubled. "We can't stay here," he said, his tone grim. "They'll be back. With reinforcements." He led her deeper into the cave, revealing a hidden chamber, a secret room that had been used for generations by his family. The room was filled with artifacts, weapons, documents, secrets of the Costa legacy. He pointed to an old, leather-bound chest in the corner of the room. "There's something in there," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Something that could help us. Something that could change everything." Katerina approached the chest, her heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She opened it, the hinges creaking in protest, revealing a collection of old letters, photographs, and documents. As she sifted through the contents of the chest, she discovered a secret that had been buried for decades, a secret that connected her family to Enzo's in a way she could never have imagined. A secret that revealed the true nature of the feud between the Espositos and the Costas, a feud that had been fueled by lies, deceit, and a thirst for revenge. A secret that implicated her own father in the death of Enzo's father, a secret that shattered her carefully constructed world. The secrets buried in the villa, unearthed in the midst of chaos, were more devastating than she could have ever imagined, revealing a truth that would forever alter the course of their lives. And the weight of that truth threatened to crush her. Chapter 13. The Unraveling of Truths. The letters were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words were still legible, their impact devastating. They were written by Caterina's grandfather, Antonio Esposito, to Enzo's grandmother, Isabella Costa, the woman Caterina had so admired, the woman who had been ostracized by her family. The letters revealed a forbidden love affair, a passionate relationship that had spanned decades, a secret that had been carefully guarded by both families. Antonio Esposito and Isabella Costa had been lovers, their relationship a betrayal of their family's loyalties, a defiance of the rigid codes that governed their world. They had met in secret, stolen moments of passion in a world consumed by hatred and violence. They had dreamed of a life together, a life free from the constraints of their family's feud, a life built on love, not hate. But their dream had been shattered. Antonio Esposito, pressured by his family, had been forced to marry another woman, a woman of suitable social standing, a woman who would solidify the Esposito family's power. Isabella Costa, heartbroken and betrayed, had married another man, a man she did not love, a man who could never replace Antonio in her heart. The letters revealed that Caterina's father, Don Esposito, had known about the affair. He had discovered the letters, years after his father's death, and had used them to manipulate and control Enzo's father, threatening to expose the secret, to shame the Costa family. He had fueled the feud, using it to his advantage, to strengthen his own position, to consolidate his power. And then there was the final letter, the most devastating of all. It was written by Don Esposito himself, to one of his associates, a man named Salvatore. The letter contained instructions, orders, to eliminate Enzo's father, to silence him forever, to prevent him from revealing the truth about the affair. Caterina read the letter again and again, her mind reeling, her heart breaking. Her own father, the man she had respected, the man she had obeyed, was a murderer, a liar, a manipulator. He had been responsible for the death of Enzo's father, the man Enzo had revered, the man he had sworn to avenge. She looked at Enzo, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and grief. He had known that her father was involved in his father's death, but he had not known the full extent of his treachery, the depth of his betrayal. "I didn't know," Katerina stammered, her voice choked with emotion. "I had no idea." He reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, his grip firm. He didn't blame her. He understood. She was as much a victim of her father's lies as he was. "I know," he said softly, his voice laced with a profound sadness. The unraveling of truths had shattered their world, exposing the rotten foundation upon which their family's legacies had been built. The feud, the hatred, the violence had all been based on a lie, a secret that had been carefully guarded for decades. They were both victims, pawns in a game that had been rigged from the start. But they were also survivors. They had found each other, amidst the chaos, amidst the lies, amidst the hatred. They had forged a connection, a bond, that was stronger than the forces that sought to tear them apart. The truth was devastating, but it was also liberating. It freed them from the shackles of the past, from the burden of their family's legacies. It allowed them to see each other, not as enemies, but as two individuals, bound together by a shared tragedy, a shared love, a shared hope for a future free from the shadows of the past. But the truth also presented a new, terrifying challenge: how to navigate a world where their families, their histories, and their very identities had been built on a foundation of lies. The path forward was shrouded in uncertainty, and the unraveling of truths had only just begun. Chapter 14. Threads of Betrayal and Love. The revelation in the cave changed everything. The lines between enemy and ally, between right and wrong, blurred. Katerina and Enzo were left adrift in a sea of uncertainty, their pasts shattered, their future unclear. They knew they couldn't stay in the cave forever, but returning to the world they knew was no longer an option. Enzo, despite the shock and grief he felt, took charge. He had a network of contacts, allies outside the traditional mafia structure, people who owed him favors, people he could trust. He made calls, using a secure line he had hidden in the cave, arranging for transportation, for a safe haven, for a new beginning. Katerina, meanwhile, grappled with the weight of her father's betrayal. She had always known him as a hard man, a man of strict principles, but she had never imagined him capable of such cruelty, such deceit. She felt a profound sense of loss, a grief for the father she thought she knew, a grief for the life she had lost. As they waited for Enzo's contacts to arrive, they talked, sharing their pain, their anger, their confusion. They clung to each other, finding solace in their shared vulnerability, their shared love, a love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of their former lives. "What will we do?" Katerina asked, her voice laced with fear and uncertainty. "Where will we go?" Enzo held her close, his arms encircling her, his touch a source of comfort and strength. "We'll start over," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "We'll build a new life, a life free from the lies, from the violence, from the hatred." He spoke of a place far away, a place where they could be anonymous, where they could escape the reach of their families, where they could build a future together, a future based on honesty, on trust, on love. It was a dream, a fragile hope, but it was all they had. They clung to it, drawing strength from each other, from their love, a love that had become their anchor in a sea of chaos. Late that night, Enzo's contacts arrived, a small group of trusted men, armed and ready to help them escape. They left the cave under the cover of darkness, embarking on a journey into the unknown, leaving behind the world they knew, the world that had betrayed them. As they traveled, Katerina reflected on the tangled threads of betrayal and love that had woven the fabric of her life. She had been betrayed by her father, by her family, by the traditions she had been raised to uphold. But she had also found love, a love that was unexpected, forbidden, but undeniably real. She had found love with Enzo, the man who had stolen her, the man who had shown her a different world, a world of passion, of danger, but also of honesty, of vulnerability, of genuine connection. He had challenged her, questioned her, and ultimately liberated her. The journey was long and arduous, filled with danger and uncertainty. They had to avoid the authorities, the Bellinis, and even members of Enzo's own family who might see him as a traitor. They had to rely on their wits, their courage, and their trust in each other. But with each passing mile, with each obstacle they overcame, their bond grew stronger, their love deepened, their hope for a new beginning solidified. The threads of betrayal were slowly unraveling, replaced by the stronger, more resilient threads of love, a love that was forged in the crucible of adversity, a love that was their only hope for a future free from the shadows of the past. This journey, however, was not just a physical one, it was a journey of the soul, a journey of transformation, a journey towards an uncertain destination where they hoped to finally find peace and redemption. But the past, they knew, had a long reach, and the shadows they were fleeing were not easily outrun. Chapter 15. The Storm Within and Without. Their journey took them across the country, a clandestine odyssey, through hidden routes and secret safe houses. They moved under the cover of darkness, avoiding major cities, relying on Enzo's network of contacts, a patchwork of individuals who owed him favors, people who lived on the fringes of society, people who understood the need for discretion. The constant threat of discovery weighed heavily on them. They were fugitives, hunted by both the law and the mafia, their lives hanging precariously in the balance. The stress took its toll, exacerbating the emotional turmoil they were already experiencing. Katerina, still reeling from the revelation of her father's treachery, struggled with feelings of guilt, shame, and anger. She found herself questioning everything she had ever believed in, her entire identity shaken to its core. She had nightmares, haunted by images of her father, of Ricardo, of the violence she had witnessed. Enzo, burdened by the weight of his family's legacy and his own past actions, battled his own demons. He was determined to protect Katerina, to build a new life for them, but he was also haunted by the fear of failure, the fear of repeating the mistakes of his father, the fear of losing the woman he loved. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of adversity, was tested to its limits. They had moments of intense closeness, sharing their fears, their hopes, their dreams, clinging to each other for comfort and support. But they also had moments of conflict, their anxieties and frustrations erupting in arguments, in accusations, in moments of doubt and despair. One night, while sheltering in a remote farmhouse, a storm raged outside, mirroring the storm within them. The wind howled, the rain lashed against the windows, the thunder echoing through the valley. Katerina, unable to sleep, sat by the window, watching the storm, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Enzo found her there, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a concern that mirrored her own. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed, her voice choked with emotion. "Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed in, it was all a lie." He sat beside her, his arm encircling her, drawing her close. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply held her, his presence a source of comfort and strength. "You are Katerina," he said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "You are the woman I love. You are strong, you are intelligent, you are compassionate. You are not defined by your family's past, by their lies, by their betrayals." His words, his touch, his belief in her, helped to calm the storm within her, to ease the turmoil that threatened to consume her. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, drawing strength from his presence. "And you, Enzo," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you are not your father. You are not defined by his mistakes. You are a good man, a man capable of love, of compassion, of change." He held her tighter, his body trembling slightly. He had needed to hear those words, to be reminded of the man he wanted to be, the man he was striving to become. The storm outside raged on, but within the small farmhouse, a sense of peace began to settle. They had weathered another storm, both internal and external, their bond strengthened by the shared experience, their love a beacon in the darkness. They had faced their demons, their fears, their doubts, and had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, more resilient, more determined than ever to build a new life together. But even as the storm subsided, a sense of unease lingered, a premonition that the greatest challenges were yet to come. The calm, they knew, was temporary, a brief respite before the next wave of adversity crashed upon them. Chapter 16. A Choice Between Worlds. They reached their destination, a small, isolated coastal town, far from the reach of their families, a place where they hoped to find anonymity, a place where they could start anew. They rented a small cottage overlooking the sea, a simple dwelling, far removed from the opulent villas they had once called home. They adopted new identities, using false names, creating a fabricated past, trying to blend in with the local community. Enzo found work as a fisherman, his skills honed from years spent on his family's boats, his strong physique well suited to the demanding labor. Katerina used her artistic talents to create and sell paintings, her work capturing the beauty of the sea and the surrounding landscape, her art a form of therapy, a way to express the emotions she couldn't voice. They tried to create a normal life, a life free from violence, from fear, from the shadows of the past. They shared meals, they walked on the beach, they explored the town, they tried to forget the world they had left behind. But the past was not easily erased. They were constantly looking over their shoulders, wary of strangers, fearful of discovery. The nightmares persisted, the memories haunted them, the fear of retribution lingered. One day, a letter arrived, a letter addressed to Katerina, using her real name. It was from Antonio, her father's consigliere, the man who had always treated her with kindness, the man who had seemed to understand her, even when her own father did not. The letter was a plea, a request for her to return home. Antonio wrote that her father was ill, that he was dying, that he wanted to see her, to make amends, to ask for her forgiveness. He wrote that the Bellinis had been dealt with, that the threat was gone, that she was safe to return. Katerina was torn. A part of her longed to see her father, to hear his apology, to find closure, to heal the wounds of the past. But another part of her, the stronger part, was wary, suspicious, distrustful. She had been betrayed too many times, lied to, manipulated, used. She couldn't trust her father. She couldn't trust Antonio. She couldn't trust anyone from that world. She showed the letter to Enzo, her hand trembling, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. He read it, his expression grim, his eyes filled with concern. It could be a trap, he said, his voice cautious. They could be lying. They could be trying to lure you back. He was right. She knew it. But the pull of family, the desire for reconciliation, the longing for a connection to her past, was strong. But what if it's not? She asked, her voice pleading. What if he's truly sorry? What if he really wants to see me? Enzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep understanding, a profound empathy. He knew the pain she was feeling, the conflict that raged within her. It's your decision, Katerina, he said, his voice soft, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek. I will support you, whatever you choose. But I will not let you go alone. I will be by your side, always. His words, his unwavering support, his willingness to risk everything for her, gave her the strength she needed to make a decision. She had to choose between two worlds, the world of her past, the world of family, of duty, of obligation, and the world of her future, the world of love, of freedom, of choice. She had to choose between her father and Enzo, between the life she had left behind and the life she was building with the man she loved. The choice was agonizing, but it was also clear. She had found something precious, something rare, something worth fighting for. And she wasn't going to let it go. The decision, though painful, brought a sense of liberation, a sense of finally taking control of her own destiny. But the choice also came with a profound sense of finality, a severing of ties that could never be fully mended. Chapter 17. Scars of the Heart. Katerina wrote back to Antonio, a letter filled with a mixture of anger, grief, and forgiveness. She told him that she couldn't return, that she couldn't trust her father, that she had chosen a different path, a different life. She told him that she forgave him, that she forgave her father, but that she couldn't forget the past, the betrayal, the lies, the violence. It was a difficult letter to write, a painful farewell to the life she had known, a final severing of ties to her family. But it was also a liberating letter, a declaration of independence, a statement of her own strength, her own resilience, her own choice. She gave the letter to Enzo to read, her heart pounding, her eyes filled with a mixture of trepidation and hope. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable, his silence unnerving. When he finished, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound respect, a deep admiration. He folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. "It's a good letter, Katerina," he said, his voice soft, his hand reaching out to take hers. "It's honest, it's brave, it's you." His words, his approval, his understanding meant everything to her. She had made the right decision. She had chosen love. She had chosen freedom. She had chosen her own path. They sent the letter, knowing that it would likely be the last contact she would ever have with her family. It was a painful sacrifice, a severing of a bond that had once been unbreakable. But it was also a necessary step, a step towards healing, towards building a new life, a life free from the shadows of the past. The days that followed were filled with a quiet melancholy, a sense of loss, but also a sense of peace. Katerina had made her choice, and she was at peace with it. She had found a new family, a new home, a new love. Enzo, sensing her sadness, tried to distract her, to comfort her. He took her on long walks along the beach. He cooked her favorite meals. He held her close at night, his presence a constant source of strength and reassurance. One evening, as they sat on the beach, watching the sunset, the sky ablaze with color, he spoke of his own past, of his own scars, of the wounds that had never fully healed. He told her about his mother, a woman he had loved deeply, a woman who had tried to protect him from the violence of their world, a woman who had died too young, leaving him with a void that had never been filled. He told her about his father, a man he had both admired and feared, a man who had taught him the ways of the mafia, a man who had ultimately betrayed him, a man whose legacy he was now trying to escape. He told her about the violence he had witnessed, the violence he had participated in, the guilt he carried, the remorse he felt. As he spoke, Katerina listened, her heart aching for him, her own pain mirroring his. She realized that they were both scarred, both wounded, both carrying the burdens of their pasts. But they were also healing, slowly, gradually, together. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, a silent acknowledgement of their shared pain, their shared healing, their shared love. "We'll heal together, Enzo," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "We'll build a new life, a life free from the scars of the past, a life filled with love, with peace, with happiness." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a gratitude, a hope, a love that transcended words. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that sealed their promise, their commitment, their future together. The scars of the heart, they knew, would never fully disappear, but they could learn to live with them, to heal from them, to build a life together despite them. The pain of the past, however, served as a constant reminder of the fragility of their new life, a life that could be shattered at any moment by the long reach of their former world. Chapter 18. The Gathering Shadows. Life in the small coastal town settled into a rhythm, a semblance of normalcy that was both comforting and unsettling. Katerina and Enzo worked, they explored, they built a quiet life together, trying to forget the past, trying to embrace the future. But the shadows of their former lives lingered, a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked, the threat that could shatter their fragile peace at any moment. They had been careful, cautious, using false names, avoiding contact with anyone who might recognize them. But they knew that their escape couldn't last forever, that their past would eventually catch up with them. One day, a stranger arrived in town, a man who seemed out of place, a man who asked too many questions, a man who watched them, his eyes filled with a knowing suspicion. Enzo recognized him, a man from his past, a man who worked for one of his rivals, a man who was known for his ruthlessness, his efficiency, his loyalty to his boss. The shadows were gathering, closing in, threatening to engulf them. Enzo knew that they couldn't stay, that they had to move again, to disappear again, to start over again. He told Katerina, his voice grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She understood. She had always known that this day might come, that their idyllic life was built on a foundation of sand. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice calm, her heart filled with a quiet resignation. She had learned to accept the uncertainty, the constant threat, the precariousness of their existence. Enzo didn't answer. He didn't know. He had exhausted his network of contacts, his resources were dwindling, his options were limited. He decided to take a risk, a desperate gamble. He contacted an old friend, a man he hadn't spoken to in years, a man who had left the mafia, a man who had built a new life for himself, a man he hoped he could trust. He arranged a meeting, a secret rendezvous, in a remote location, far from the town, far from the prying eyes of their enemies. He left Katerina in the cottage, promising to return, his heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. Katerina waited, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. She paced the floor. She watched the sea. She prayed for his safety, for their future. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, the sky turning a fiery red, a reflection of the turmoil within her. She heard a noise, a car approaching, her heart leaping with a mixture of hope and fear. She rushed to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She opened it, expecting to see Enzo, but it wasn't him. It was Antonio, her father's consigliere, the man she had written to, the man she had thought she could trust. He stood there, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. Behind him stood several men, armed and menacing, their faces hard, their eyes cold. "I'm sorry, Katerina," Antonio said, his voice heavy with a sadness that seemed genuine. "But you have to come with us." The gathering shadows had finally caught up with them. The past had returned, with a vengeance. Katerina's fragile peace had been shattered, her hope extinguished, her future uncertain. She was a prisoner once again, a pawn in a game she had tried to escape, a game she could never truly win. The choice she had made, the life she had built, had been ripped away from her, leaving her vulnerable and alone, facing an uncertain future, a future that seemed darker than ever before. The betrayal was complete, and this time, it came from a source she had never anticipated. Chapter 19. Reckoning and Redemption. Katerina was taken back to her family home, the opulent villa that had once been her prison, the place she had vowed never to return to. She was escorted to her father's study, the room where it had all begun, the room where her fate had been sealed. Don Esposito was dying, his body frail, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and regret. He was a shadow of his former self, the powerful Don reduced to a weak, helpless old man. Antonio stood beside him, his expression somber, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to penetrate Katerina's anger. He had betrayed her, but he had done it, he claimed, out of loyalty to her father, out of a misguided belief that he was protecting her. "Katerina," her father whispered, his voice raspy, his hand reaching out to her, his touch weak and trembling. "I had to see you one last time." She looked at him, her heart filled with a conflicting mix of emotions, anger, resentment, pity, and a lingering, undeniable sense of familial connection. She had hated him, she had feared him, but he was still her father, the man who had raised her, the man who had, in his own twisted way, loved her. "Why, Papa?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Why did you do it? Why did you lie? Why did you betray Enzo? Why did you betray me?" He coughed, a painful, racking sound that shook his frail body. He struggled to speak, his words barely audible. I did it for the family," he whispered. "To protect our legacy, our power." His words were hollow, unconvincing, even to him. He had sacrificed everything for power, for control, for a legacy that was built on lies, on violence, on betrayal. He had destroyed lives, ruined families, and in the end, he had lost everything. Katerina looked at him, her eyes filled with a pity that surprised her. She saw not the powerful Don, but a broken old man, consumed by regret, facing the consequences of his actions. "It wasn't worth it, Papa," she said, her voice soft, her heart aching for him, for the wasted years, for the lost opportunities. None of it was worth it. He closed his eyes, a tear tracing a path down his wrinkled cheek.
He knew she was right.
He had made a terrible mistake, a mistake that had cost him everything, a mistake he could never undo. Before he could say another word, a commotion erupted outside the study. Shouts, screams, the sound of gunfire, the familiar sounds of violence that had defined her life. Enzo. He had come for her. Antonio rushed to the door, his hand on his gun, ready to defend her father, to protect the family, even from the man Katerina loved.
"Stop,"
Katerina cried, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "Please, Antonio. No more violence. No more bloodshed." Antonio hesitated, his eyes meeting hers, his expression torn between loyalty and compassion. He had always cared for her. He had always tried to protect her, even from her own father. He lowered his gun, his decision made. He stepped aside, allowing Enzo to enter the study, his gun drawn, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes blazing with a dangerous intensity. Enzo saw Katerina, his gaze softening, his relief evident. He saw her father, his enemy, the man who had caused him so much pain, the man he had sworn to kill. He raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger, his body tense, ready to fire.
"Enzo, no,"
Katerina cried, stepping between him and her father, shielding the dying man with her own body. "Please. It's over. He's dying. Let it end here." Enzo hesitated, his eyes locked on hers, his internal struggle evident. He wanted revenge. He wanted justice. He wanted to end the cycle of violence that had consumed their lives. But he also loved Katerina. He saw the pain in her eyes, the plea in her voice, the compassion in her heart. He saw the woman she was, the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had shown him a different way, a different path. He lowered his gun, his decision made. He would not kill her father. He would not perpetuate the cycle of violence. He would choose love. He would choose forgiveness. He would choose a different future. The reckoning had come, but it was not the reckoning he had expected. It was a reckoning of the heart, a reckoning of the soul, a reckoning that demanded a different kind of justice, a justice tempered with mercy, with compassion, with love. The redemption was not his alone, it was theirs, a shared redemption, a shared victory over the darkness that had consumed their lives. But the victory was bittersweet, tinged with the sorrow of loss, the weight of the past, and the uncertainty of the future. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Don Esposito died that night, his passing quiet and peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence that had defined his life. Katerina was with him, holding his hand, offering him a forgiveness he didn't deserve, but that she needed to give. Enzo stood by her side, his presence a silent support, his love a constant reassurance. Antonio, his loyalty to the Esposito family shattered by Don Esposito's death and Katerina's plea for peace, helped them escape, ensuring their safe passage out of the villa, out of the city, out of the reach of the mafia. He had chosen loyalty to Katerina, loyalty to a different kind of future, a future free from violence, from hatred, from the endless cycle of revenge. Katerina and Enzo returned to the small coastal town, to the simple life they had built, to the fragile peace they had found. But they knew that they could never truly escape the past, that the shadows of their former lives would always linger. They decided to leave Italy, to start over in a new country, a new continent, a place where they could be anonymous, where they could build a life free from the constant threat of discovery, free from the burden of their family's legacies. They sold the cottage, gathered their few belongings, and embarked on a new journey, a journey towards an uncertain future, but a future filled with hope, with love, with the promise of a new beginning. Before they left, Caterina visited her grandmother Isabella's grave, the woman who had shown her a different path, the woman who had taught her about love, about forgiveness, about the importance of following one's own heart. She placed a bouquet of roses on the grave, a symbol of her love, her gratitude, her remembrance. "Thank you, Nana," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "for showing me the way." Enzo stood beside her, his arm encircling her waist, his presence a silent support, his love a constant reassurance. He understood the importance of this moment, the need for closure, the need to honor the past, even as they moved towards the future. They left the cemetery, hand in hand, their hearts filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope, of grief and gratitude, of loss and love. They were leaving behind everything they had ever known, everything they had ever been, but they were also embracing a new life, a new identity, a new future. The final confrontation had not been a battle of guns and violence, but a confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Caterina had confronted her family's legacy, her father's betrayal, her own past. Enzo had confronted his desire for revenge, his own demons, his own inherited darkness. They had both chosen love, they had both chosen forgiveness, they had both chosen a different path. They had chosen to break the cycle of violence, to reject the hatred, to embrace a future built on hope, on trust, on a love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of their former lives. This choice, however, was not the end of their journey, it was the beginning. They had a long road ahead of them, a road filled with challenges, with uncertainties, but also with possibilities, with opportunities, with the promise of a life lived on their own terms. The confrontation had been won, but the battle for their future was just beginning. Epilogue. Years passed. The sun-drenched shores of Italy were replaced by the vibrant, bustling streets of a new city, a place far removed from the shadows of their past. Caterina and Enzo, now known by different names, had built a life together, a life that was a testament to their resilience, their courage, and their enduring love. Caterina, her artistic talents flourishing, had become a renowned painter, her canvases filled with the vibrant colors of their new home, her art a reflection of her journey, her healing, her transformation. Her work spoke of loss, of pain, but also of hope, of resilience, of the enduring power of the human spirit. Enzo, his skills honed from years of navigating a dangerous world, had found a new purpose, a new calling. He used his intelligence, his strategic mind, his understanding of human nature to help others, to protect the vulnerable, to fight for justice in a different way, a way that was legal, ethical, and ultimately more fulfilling. They had built a family, a small, loving family, a sanctuary from the world, a testament to their love, their commitment, their shared dream. They had a daughter, a beautiful, intelligent, compassionate girl, whom they named Isabella, after Caterina's grandmother, the woman who had shown her the path to freedom, to love, to self-discovery. They never forgot their past, the scars remained, but they had learned to live with them, to heal from them, to use them as a reminder of the choices they had made, the battles they had fought, the love that had sustained them. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their home, watching the sunset, the sky ablaze with color, their daughter playing at their feet, Caterina turned to Enzo, her eyes filled with a love that had deepened with time, a love that had weathered every storm, a love that had endured. "We made it, Enzo," she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching out to take his, her fingers intertwining with his, a familiar gesture, a symbol of their unbreakable bond. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes, a smile that reflected the peace, the contentment, the happiness they had found. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of a love that had conquered all, a love that was their destiny, their redemption, their future. "Yes, Kara," he replied, his voice husky with emotion, his eyes reflecting the same deep love that filled hers. "We made it.
Together."
The past was behind them, the shadows had receded, the future stretched before them, a future filled with hope, with promise, with the enduring power of their love. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale, but in the reality they had created, a reality forged in the crucible of adversity, a reality that was a testament to their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering belief in each other. The journey had been long, arduous, and often painful, but it had led them to this, to a life of peace, of love, of enduring happiness. And in that moment, they knew, with absolute certainty, that it had.